Hey everybody, it's Angmar VHS. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're looking at a preview for the mod Total War Wainriders. This is a mod that has been in development for quite some time, using the original Rome Total War Alexander expansion as its base. And we're talking today about Angmar. This is a faction that I think a lot of people are interested in. I've got some requests to take another look at them. And if you're interested in any of the other factions, specifically looking at units or looking at their campaign starts, I do have a bunch of videos on the channel about this mod and how all of those factions work. So you can find more about Angmar if you're interested in that by taking a look at some of the other videos I have. In this one, we're kind of looking at the campaign map. Specifically, we're looking at the settlement names, the settlement distribution, and sort of getting a sense for how this faction is going to perform. What are their challenges going to be? What are the opportunities? Just kind of an excuse to talk about Angmar in general. Now, we can put them in a bit of a historical context at the start here. So the mod starts in the year 1864. The main action in the mod is really happening away to the southeast. That's the emergence of the Wainriders, their conquest of Rovanion, and the death of a king of Gondor as part of that conquest. So the Wainriders are currently getting themselves established at the time the mod starts off, but there is stuff happening in the northwest as well. If you're familiar with the lore, specifically the appendices to the Lord of the Rings, you may know that about 100 years or so after our start date, there is a rather significant war that occurs in the northwest, involving Arnor, involving Gondor, in fact, and involving Angmar. And this war is basically the end of Arnor or Arthedain as an independent realm. And basically, Angmar ends up conquering all of the northwest, at least the Arnor parts of it. And it is only through the intervention of Gondor, which sends a fleet up to Lindon, that the Witch King is eventually driven in a rout out of the north. So this is sort of the lead up to those significant events. But prior to that, there also had been some important occurrences. So Angmar as an entity, we know, arose around the year 1300. There's some interesting things happening around Middle-earth at that time. I believe we read about orcs multiplying in the Misty Mountains around 1300 in the Third Age. We also know that there was a campaign, a successful campaign, carried out just about 50 years prior to that by Minalcar, who was then the regent of Gondor. And he was essentially taking over from a king who couldn't be bothered with ruling. And his goal, Minalcar's goal as regent, was to execute a campaign against the Easterlings and to sort of drive a wedge between those Easterlings and the Northmen of Rovanion. They were the Northmen were, allies of Gondor, but they had been siding, or at least some of them had been siding with the Easterlings in various, raids. And who knows? The discussion is rather vague, but there was enough of a threat that Minalcar sets a campaign, teaming up with. Is this the one where does he team up with Vidugavia? I can't remember if he's specifically named during that campaign, but regardless, Minalcar is very successful here. He has Northmen allies, and he basically destroys an army of the Easterlings, and destroys all of their camps and settlements, possibly around the Sea of Rune. It's a little vague, it's a little unclear as to what happens there. There's suggestion of some scribal errors, shall we say, with regard to the recording of those events. But nevertheless, I've always thought it's interesting that around the time Gondor is somewhat in ascendant, right, in the south and in the east, driving back the Easterlings, about 50 years after that campaign of 1248, that's when we see Angmar begin to coalesce. The interesting thing, too, about Angmar is that for the first century or so, it's very much a shadow kingdom, in the sense that we are not told that it does much of anything. We are told that it gathers, the Witch King gathers to him many, men, orcs, and other servants, right? These are presumably, who knows, trolls, wargs, other creatures potentially. But it's only in 1409 that Angmar strikes directly. Now, there is a battle in 1356, I believe, where Rudour specifically, which at that point is ruled by a hillman who is in secret league with Angmar, Rudour being one of the three sort of sub-kingdoms of Arnor. Rudour attacks Arthedain, attempts to take the Weather Hills and Weathertop specifically. They end up actually killing a king of Arthedain who had only been on the throne for like 7 years. But this is done without, apparently, any involvement from Angmar directly. So it's interesting to me that 50 plus years after Angmar is establishing itself, it is at best making these sort of shadow alliances with other potential factions, right? Most importantly with Rudour. I think Rudour is a fascinating kingdom in this period too, because we learn that this is not ruled by Dunedain, and I just want to pause and note how remarkable that is. That there is a kingdom that has been established, has been part of the North Kingdom, and was Dunedainic even in the civil wars that followed, and had been going on for centuries at that time. And the power there is seized somehow by this hillman who is not a Dunedain. So how did that go over? Well, apparently it went over fine by the local Dunedain. We do not hear of any pushback against his reign in Rudour. We know that there are Dunedain there. There are still references to Dunedain later than this point. And so that suggests that a couple of things. It could suggest that the Dunedain and Rudour are just a bunch of, evil jerks, right? That could very well be the case. But I think it's more interesting to suppose that things are pretty complicated over there. After all, Tolkien is really good about displaying what I find to be a pretty realistic morality. We see all sorts of motivations for characters, whether they're acting in sort of good faith or for their own purposes, their motivations are pretty complex and it seems to me pretty realistic. So I could imagine that there are some Dunedain who are trying to preserve a kind of independence in Rudour, but maybe through some inability to choose among themselves who would be the best to take power. Maybe the line had simply grown thin, right? There are not enough members of the royal house in Rudour, and so the best thing to do, in their opinion, is throw their support behind this hillman, who has, I would imagine, a larger population base to draw from. If we take a look at Rudour, and the reason I'm going on about this a little bit is because this mod starts after these events, right, of 1356 and 1409. We're hundreds of years out from that point. But I think the history of those earlier centuries does give us something interesting to think about, and a bit of maybe justification for some of the decisions we made in the mod. Now, as we're looking at this, you're seeing a lot of red faces and things, and I probably should have caveated this in the beginning like I always do, but this is a work in progress and we are not done yet. One of the things that we need to do is set up the settlement stuff with all the buildings that they're going to have and all of the proper effects for those buildings. So of course, when you are playing Angmar, you will not have to put up with this level of unhappiness. You will be these areas will be pretty happy for you, at least initially. Maybe there are going to be some problems, but basically down here between the rivers here, we're seeing kind of the heartland of Rudour, I would imagine. And then Rudour does own territory over here, north of the road, so like up here as well. And then over here we're seeing like the Weather Hills along this line, I suppose. So we have a fairly large territory here by the time our mod starts, Rudour, or what was Rudour, takes up half of the territory that you own as the faction of Angmar. So there is some utility, I think, in thinking about what Rudour was and what it is now that you have it. Now, in my view, there's a sort of a tragic history to the hillmen in Rudour, right? So 1356 is kind of their high point. At some point, they had seized power, right? And they probably held it for about 7 years prior, because we're told that the king the king of Arthedain, who dies in that 1356 battle at the hands of Rudaur's warriors, that king was basically refused. He basically made a request, hey, I'm going to be the king of Arnor now, everyone submit, basically. And Rudaur says no. And they have their new hillman chief, who is the new king, and then there's war, right? So it's interesting that Rudaur declares its independence, so to speak, from Arnor, or certainly from the leadership of Arthedain. There's nothing spectacularly unusual in that, by the way. That had been going on for centuries at this point. All these kingdoms, Arthedain, Rudaur, and Cardolan to the southwest, had been, quarreling for some time. But again, it's interesting that there's this extra dimension of this new population group, which we'd never heard of before, called the Hillmen. And it's easy to see why there would be people called Hillmen in this region out of all the regions of Arnor. Rudaur is certainly the hilliest. It's the most mountainous, it's the most unfriendly in terms of terrain. We know a little bit about that terrain from The Lord of the Rings, and from The Hobbit, in fact, because both Bilbo and Frodo passed through this kind of hilly, forested, difficult territory on their way to Rivendell. So we can imagine that there's a landscape that is rather difficult to traverse, and that makes it very welcoming, I would say, for the development of minor chiefdoms, or sort of these clannish organizations. And that's the kind of thing you would imagine from a group of, let's say, non-Dunedainic local native populations, right, who've just been doing their own thing in the hills for, millennia. This is very, very different from what we would imagine in Arthedain or in Cardolan, where the landscape seems to be a lot more friendly to settlement, to agriculture, to movement of armies and growth of population. And both of these places also don't have large non-Dunedainic population groups. At least those population groups have been successfully integrated. So, for example, we know that there were people in Bree, going back to the Second Age, who were not Dunedain, because when the Númenóreans arrived on the shores of Middle-earth, they met with some of these men at Bree, I think at the Barrow Downs, or possibly the Tower Hills. Regardless, they met with these men of Bree, and they recognized a kinship among them. I don't think it was called Bree at that time, but regardless, there was a sort of a population group there. But we never hear of this population group, the non-Dunedainic element in Arthedain, as offering any particular resistance or trouble or anything like that. Same thing with Cardolan. Now, in Cardolan, there were presumably non-Dunedainic people as well. Most likely, in Erenvorn, in the forested region here, along the coasts. But again, they seem to have not been hostile. And so Rudaur is very interesting in that regard. And not that the Hillmen were hostile per se, but they do seem to have maintained a distinct identity for, hundreds of years, certainly probably millennia, and sort of maintained that up until that 1356 battle. Now, the tragedy of this Hillman population is that, whatever you want to say about this Lord of the Hillmen who seizes power, he is described as evil, by the way. This evil Lord of the Hillmen seizes power in Rudaur. He didn't die in that battle of 1356, and we don't know what happened to him, but we do know that in 1409, Angmar comes down and takes over Rudaur directly. And the reason that I think this occurs as something of a hostile takeover of Rudaur by Angmar is because of the route that is described in the appendices for that war of 1409. They say that a great army came out of Angmar and crossed the river and attacked the Weather Hills. There is no need for an army coming from Carn Dûm to cross the river, right, to attack the Weather Hills. They could just come straight line southwest from Carn Dûm, and they would get where they need to be. No rivers needed to be crossed. So why would they take this tortuous route? My suspicion is that en route, they snuff out, they pretty much install their own leadership over Angmar. There's nothing that is said specifically to that effect, but the independence of Rhudaur is never again mentioned. Rhudaur is never a prime actor again. It's mentioned sort of as a region, but not as an actor on the world stage. So it seems to me that Angmar's forces come down, basically take over Rhudaur, and then continue on their own way. So that's 1409. And that justifies our inclusion of all of the lands of Rhudaur under your control when you start as Angmar. However, I don't think that there was necessarily a total elimination of the hillmen element. And in fact, I think from the very beginning, there was sort of a native element, native sort of middlemen element in Angmar's forces. I believe the first group of people who is mentioned as being gathered by the Witch King in 1300 when Angmar is being founded, I think the first group mentioned is men. He gathered to him many men. And the easiest way for me to read that is that these are locals. These are like natives of the region. I don't think these are Dunedain, right? He just says men. He doesn't say that these are disaffected rebels from Arnor, Arthedain or Rhudaur or anything. He just says they're men, or the appendices just say that they are men. And in fact, Carn Dûm being the capital, it seems more likely that these would not be people from Arthedain or Rhudaur even, because it's simply far away. And these are not empty lands, I would imagine. For one thing, we know the Lossoth live not too far in the northwest. And in Appendix A, there's a very interesting discussion of the Lossoth. This has to do with the last days of Arvedui, the last king of Arthedain. And again, this is occurring to, this is referencing events that occur about 100 years after the start date of our mod, so 1975, 1976, I think. But Arvedui meets with these Lossoth, and then we get this discussion, the only one anywhere in Tolkien's writings, about what the Lossoth are. And it says that, they live mostly inaccessible to their enemies, way up here. Who are the enemies of the Lossoth? We never hear about them fighting, the people of Arthedain. I think it's not unreasonable that they're fighting like other people around them, and that when the Witch King started gathering his people to him around 1300, that some of those people would have been from the Lossoth potentially, and certainly from other men who'd been living in the hills around about. So at any rate, I think that it's reasonable to suppose that the Mannish population of Angmar is not Dunedainic. Now, I know that sort of flies in the face of other imaginings of Angmar, and as we'll see when we get to the battle here, there is a stronger, almost North Mannish kind of element to what we've done with Angmar. Now, and again, in other media, in other mods, I believe, there is a stronger implication of Angmar being sort of like a Black Númenórean holdout somehow. Even though, to me, the Black Númenóreans seem to be much more strongly associated with the south, so like Umbar, Harad, those types of things, or, at least those realms far away down south when the Númenóreans were establishing them, right? I don't know that any Númenóreans would have gone over to Angmar and just kind of hung out up here. It seems like a pretty desolate place by all accounts. So instead of that, we've gone with a more sort of rough and ready local guys sort of aesthetic for Angmar. It's, of course, augmented by orcs, by trolls, by other various units. And there are some gradations within the Mannish units, as you would imagine. At the lower tiers, they're going to be more rough, and at the higher tiers, they're going to have better armor and weapons. So that's sort of a bit about the history of Angmar and how that sort of factors into our decision-making about unit rosters. And so I think it makes sense. The other thing that you've got to remember is that Angmar held territory on both sides of the Misty Mountains. And this was, in some ways, the last to fall. We had the Eotheod coming up around 1976, I want to say, under, was it Fram? Frumgar. It was Frumgar, who came up north here and basically drove out the last of the people of Angmar. It's not told what sort those people are, whether they are men or orcs or something else. But basically, this becomes the homeland from which Eora would eventually arise. But so Angmar has, again, a sort of a large territory, and that means there's lots of different kinds of people living within it, I think. And it seems to make sense to have a more woodsy, kind of Northmanish, Middlemanish aesthetic for a lot of their units. Not all, though, as we will see. All right, so looking at settlements here, we do have a bit of a different distribution from what you might expect from, let's say, 4th Age Total War. Some of these settlements are rather similar in their placement. Of course, Karn Doom is going to be an essential settlement here, right up in the hills, or the mountains of Angmar, as they are called. And then you've got Forodrain off to the west. This is a settlement name that is retained from 4th Age Total War. And then we've got Tauradal, which is similarly retained from 4th Age. But Hithlad is a new one. This is a new name. And Pineth Gwathrin is also a new one. I believe, does Pineth mean hills? Not quite sure about the reference there. But Gwath, probably shadow, some element of that. And so we've got a settlement here sort of in the arms of these two mountains or hill ranges. Gives Angmar a bit of a more population base outside of Rudour. But this is where the most probably action is going to occur, at least initially, because you've got a couple of directions to watch out for. Of course, you're going to be at war with Arthedain to the west. You've got rebels to your south. But then to your east, you've also got the High Pass, which is somewhere around here. And this is going to lead you down into Eotheod territory. And so that means that, there's Eotheod down here. There's also elves, and we don't know what they're going to do. There's a sort of the elven king's territory over here that you may need to watch for. So it's not simply a matter of walling off the High Pass and hoping it's good, because you do have a faction, or a couple of factions over here, and you do have this outpost in your sort of your easternmost settlement, which you will need to guard and watch out for. You're not alone, however, because in the east and sort of scattered in between your own territories are those of your allies, and this is these are going to be allies. It's currently set to be neutral, but this will be an allied faction. The orcs, essentially, the orcs of the Misty Mountains, and they're going to have some settlements in the Grey Mountains as well. So this will be potentially a source of trade with you for a while, but it could very well be the case that you end up going to war with them, right? I could easily imagine that occurring. This is not going to be a strong alliance like we saw in the 4th Age between, let's say, Rohan and the Reunited Kingdom. The orcs and the people of Angmar are going to be allied initially, but may certainly find themselves at cross purposes. It may be difficult for the orcs to sort of expand without stepping on your toes, right? And vice versa. So at best, you're going to rely on them as sort of a trading partner and hope you can encourage them to go off and attack the Elven King, or maybe go farther east, attack the dwarves and the men living around the Lonely Mountain and the Long Lake. Maybe you'll be able to get them to do something to the west, but most likely that's going to be you. So let's actually remove the fog of war here and see what you're dealing with your most sort of immediate neighbor to the west, which is Arthedain, or Arnor, as we're calling them in the mod. Even though Arnor, of course, applies most of the time to the much larger territory. So Arnor is, you're going to be interestingly matched, because they have some very elite units, which are stronger than a lot of the things you can field as Angmar, but those units are also going to be smaller in size and harder to get, more expensive. So you can theoretically resort to sort of an orc berserk rush sort of strategy, where you train up a lot of relatively cheap but large-sized units and kind of flood the zone. So that could be an effective strategy here. You attack a place like Fornost and Anuminas, and then you've knocked out a couple of important production centers. Anuminas, though, it does have to be said, is not going to be a super, let's say, important settlement in terms of recruitment or population. At this time, it's very much in decline. So Fornost is the capital. Fornost is by far the most important settlement, and it's right on your doorstep. So if you can take this out, then that's going to have an incredible effect on Arnor's capacity. This is a permanent fort, and you've got one of them too over here, over the crossing. What is this? Of the is this the Loudwater? I can't remember. But you've got a couple of permanent forts in the area, and here's another one, Amon Sul, right? These are not full settlements in the sense of being able to build and train and recruit everything, but they are important nonetheless because they can hold territory, particularly in your case, can hold that river crossing, or at least slow down an enemy trying to approach it. And here, this is kind of the bulwark, right, for the relatively softer lands to the west. There's going to be some rebel territories interspersed here, but a lot of these regions are going to be pretty weakly held. So if you can take out like these three places, or at least decrease the garrisons, right, deal with the armies that are around them, you'll be in a pretty good position. I do want to take a moment to point out the model for Amon Sul. Very nice, and it includes actually a set of walls and kind of fortifications stretching into the north. This is all based on what we know from, I think it's Aragorn's speech in the Fellowship of the Ring. He's talking to Frodo, and there is some discussion of walls and roads leading north from Weathertop. And the idea was that these were established many centuries before the Lord of the Rings to sort of service the forts that lay along the Weather Hills. So the Weather Hills was not simply a like a series of hills. It was sort of an active frontier for a long time, and that's kind of how it's depicted here. You've got, of course, Amon Sul itself is the big one, but you've got another one farther to the north, and that's going to help kind of connect these in a sense. And all of them are primarily protecting your farming settlements. Like you've got Bree here, or what would be later known as Bree. You've got what would later be the Shire, and then you've got the Tower Hills off into the west, and you've got what would be Sarn Ford later on. So really, Arnor is very heavily skewed to the northeast, and you've got really a lot of production centers that are relatively close to it that you can kind of hammer at them from a couple of different angles. Another thing to strongly consider is maybe a holding action, right? If you can get an army down around here and just sort of fight defensively while you have another army marching down into the south and trying to pick off some of these rebel provinces. We've got Callan Reed up here, which is an addition, right? There was not a settlement in this particular spot in 4th Age. And then Tiernost, which is the sort of representing a settlement that's grown up around the Barrow Downs. We know that the Prince of Cardolan, the last sort of Dunedain of Cardolan, held out here. That was a couple hundred years prior to the start date of the mod, so Cardolan is entirely fallen at this point. But people will be trying to refound it, and you should be doing what you can as Angmar to prevent that from happening. So Callan Reed is probably a decent early grab if you think you can take it, and maybe a quick thrust down to Tharbad would be useful as well. Just grabbing this would be nice to prevent any any incursions from, let's say, the chiefdom of the Angren or the coastal tribes who are moving up through Enedwythe. But of course, your primary foe in the region is Arnor, but they are not the only one. You do have to worry about the High Elves, who have some territories primarily around Lindon. They've got these 4 settlements here, the Forland, Harland, Mithlond, and Aglarant, sort of a new settlement we've added to help them hold the line of the Loon, essentially. And they also have a representation in Imladris. So this is actually an important settlement for them. And then they also own Lorien. So the High Elves do have a decent spread of territories. And that there's some lore justification for that, because we know that in several of the wars of Angmar, Lorien crossed the mountains and sent troops up to help out Imladris. So that happened. We know that the Lindon folks came over to help the people of Arthedain, and it makes sense to sort of put them all together as a faction, but to have the Woodland realm be off on its own. So that's essentially the kind of the threats you'll find yourself in. You've got elves all around you, and so that could be a bit of a problem because we imagine they will be a lot less passive in this campaign, which is kind of nice because, again, you did hear about elven attacks and campaigns during this period and prior. Certainly, in some ways, it's like the last gasp of the High Elves, right? Their last significant military action, actually, because by the War of the Ring, they essentially did nothing. I mean, you had Galadriel, moving off into southern Mirkwood at the very end of the war there, but there wasn't too much. So this is some opportunity to play out some interesting and dramatic Angmar versus Elven battles. So speaking of that, maybe we'll set that up and see how that might play out. All right, so I've got a fairly clear battlefield for us to fight on, so we can take a good look at the units here. This is, let's see, Spears of Angmar. This is sort of your day-to-day bodyguard unit, I believe. One of the things we wanted to emphasize within the roster of Angmar was spears, because there is that one reference in the Fellowship of the Ring when the hobbits are trapped inside the barrow, or I think it's Merry who wakes up and says, the spear in my heart, right? The men of Carn Doom attacked us or came upon us at the night. And so the idea is there's one reference to a spear. That's it in all of the writing about Angmar or Carn Doom as to what these guys would have used for weapons. And of course, it's a spear, the most common weapon in history. But we wanted to kind of run with it, and spears are cool. And so we wanted to make the faction a little bit more spear focused. So the idea is that these are you're kind of like your family members. I think this is how we've set it up. Of course, your actual faction leader is the Witch King himself. That is not a unit that is available for custom battles, but that is a sort of a separate unit. But for the day-to-day stuff, you would have these underlings, these local lords, local families, I guess, of retainers who lead their own spearmen into battle. You don't have much cav as Angmar, but you do have some. So here is a fairly elite Knights of the Shadow unit. And you notice that there's a lot of visual cues on these units that are sort of references to what you see later on in 4th Age with the cultic units, with specifically sort of the long mail coats, kind of like ankle-length stuff. And in some cases, it's not mail or not only mail, but padded armor as well. Bodyguard. So we've got a bit of that going on kind of throughout for that visual reference, but also because it's cold up in Angmar. And all of these units that are native to Angmar have sort of bonuses to fighting in the winter. Very nice unit here. Like the helmets, like the mail, like the spears too. Just big old intimidating spearheads. So these guys are going to be pretty solid infantry. That's kind of the idea, and they are supplemented by, of course, orcs, but also these mannish units like these Rudauer warriors, which are intended to represent maybe some descendants of the hillmen population, right, who would have survived. So these guys get a war cry. What else do we've got? We've got Langflood Axemen somewhere here. And these guys would be available in that eastern territory. Langflood is another word for Anduin, right? The long river or the big river. So these guys are available in one of the regions you have access to as Angmar. So it's an important reason to kind of keep that place under your control. This is a dedicated sort of armor-piercing unit. Pretty straightforward. They don't have a war cry, but they've got some good stats and good numbers, of course. Let's see. Bows of the Shadow, another one of these elite, very mail-clad units with a bit more uniform aesthetic. Orc Champions, a bit of a different look this time around. Webba revisited all of these units. Of course, in some cases, made them from scratch. And Great Orc Spears. Another unit that was missing in 4th Age was a sort of a spear-focused orc unit, like with just a simple spear and a shield. And so I like that. These guys are very exaggerated spearhead, but I like it because they are, it's very clear what they're all about. We also have some orc blades, just sort of a kind of a cannon fodder unit, just sort of throw them at the enemy and hope it works out. They also have war cry. And then for a bit of cav supplement, because you won't have those knights all the time, I'm not sure if those are like a specific unit or if you only get one or two of them, or if they're just very high up the tech tree. But Hillmen Outriders are going to be a lot of your sort of light cav duties, right? So they're going to be very useful in that regard. Now, I have no idea how this is going to work out because we're fighting the elves, the high elves, so I'm a little scared. I set it up so that we had more men than they did. I didn't give them a full 20, so we'll see. But you also get some very nice siege weaponry, so maybe this will come into play in this battle here. We'll get bolt throwers, which are basically ballistas. I'll put them at fire at will here. All right, they were in guard mode there. I'm not sure why. Guess we'll leave them on it. And then these which I imagine are going to be more effective, so we'll get them. Actually, you know what? I don't think I want them on fire at will. Maybe for obvious reasons. But this is probably not going to be super effective on the hill because the trajectory of these units is sometimes tricky to predict. But let's set them up here. Yeah, there are a lot of soldiers accompanying these units. Let's look at them again. So they are basically low-tier orcs. These are not going to hold up in a fight. So you do want to keep these siege weapons protected. Okay, we've got only 2 archer units that I brought. That's not very good. But a nice thing about this archer unit is that they have spears as a melee weapon. Or axes. It might just be axes. But that is going to be helpful. So let's get our spears, though. And I think we're going to kind of keep... Yeah, let's do something like that, and we'll let them attack the siege line if they want. And we've got, let's see, a couple of the sword units. I don't think we got a good look at them, but again, it's a very similar aesthetic for all of these higher tier shadow-based units. I think this might be, maybe one can be here and one can be here. All right, the Root Hour Warriors are going to be the aggressive ones. So you probably want them on the flanks, right? Alright, Langflood Axemen. Get our general right back here in a nice kind of central position. And the heavy cav. Man, that's a lot of heavy cav. We're playing on like large unit sizes, I guess. Light cav behind them. Let's go with... Okay, we got, yeah, Great Orc Champions. You got to remember those too, because we got the Langflood Axemen, but you also have, or the Root Hour Warriors. No, yeah, it's the Langflood guys with the two-handed axes. So you've got this unit, but you also have this unit, right, for the AP, and these guys have a War Cry. So attack of 14 versus attack of 13, but these guys, the War Cry basically improves their attack speed, I think it is. And this is just some more spear defense. All right, so that's everything. We'll just deal with it. Let's take a look at the elves. I gave them a couple of cav units. What are you? Well, we'll have to see what they are a bit closer. We can just kind of look at them now. I think this is the Cinder and Axes. Noldor swords. This may be the bodyguard unit, but I think this might be Noldor riders. It's a beautiful unit. In 4th Age, you could only get like one of these, essentially, and one of the swords, but we added some more Noldor types. So here are some, I think it's Cinder and Spears. These are Galadrim. Just, I think, standard bows. Here's some Lindon Guard. Very, very terrifying unit. And some Noldor archers here. Now, this is I want to say this is a very elite archer unit. It's not just Noldor and archers. Noldor spears. I love this unit. Just spears. I like them. Sindarin swords, Sindarin riders, some more horse archers. Right, we can see what some of these guys are. Okay, good. We're attacking. I guess I should queue up some attack orders. Let's hit the Lindon Guards if we can. Oh, did I left you out a bit too far, perhaps. Yeah, I don't know if we're actually going to get to attack because the trajectory is too high. These guys are going to be fine, but maybe I should slide my bows out of the way. Yeah, notice how we're not really doing anything to these guys? Alright, yeah, we're definitely ballistating our own guys. I thought I had you move over. Alright, so the trick is, if you tell them to hustle, like give them a run order, too soon, they'll actually stop. So you gotta wait for them to start walking and then give them the march order. Or the quick march order. Alright, Galadrim warriors, yes. Alright, what was this? Eldar nobles, that's what it is. I wonder if this is the bodyguard units. Maybe Webba or Valor can help me out here. We've got Noldor bows, we've got Eldar nobles.
Axman! Axman! Axman!
What about this? If I try to attack here... What about that? Sindar Riders. Okay, we're actually turning. Maybe able to hit the Sindar Riders. Yep.
Spearman! Spearman!
Let's see how this goes. Oh, beautiful. Yeah, so you're going to want to lean on siege weaponry whenever possible.
Archers! Spearman!
Nice. Now this is, I think, yeah, it's a basic sort of sword cav, medium cavalry unit for the elves. But all of these units are very, very elite. Yeah, let's focus on those Noldor swords. Oh yeah, and what are you guys doing? Elven scouts. All right. I think we will try to see them off with our light cav. Let's see if we can hit those swords. Nope. Alright, looks like they're getting ready for a general assault. Oh my gosh, that's terrifying. Alright, Noldor swords, yep. You know they would be winning easily. Okay, let's go chop them up. Look how quickly we get routed over here. My god! I thought maybe I made it, like, too easy on myself. Holy crap. Yep, they're not having any of it. Wow. Wow, wow, wow. The swordsmen are sticking around, to their credit. Let's get the, see if we can get any kills on these high elves here.
Your general's nerve has broken.
Yeah,
He's
wow.
fleeing from the enemy.
Let's just throw our bowmen in. What do we have? We got a sword as a secondary weapon there. There goes the general, killed by elven spears. It looks like, and that's the end of that. I'm very interested to see the report here to see how much we did. Let's take a look at these statistics, we killed 168 of them. Probably all of that was bolts. Yeah, okay, Bows of the Shadow killed 47. Bolt Throwers and Stone Hurlers, 23 and 27. Grimbows did 32. Hillman Outriders did kill 20 on the charge, and 12. Yeah, Spears of Angmar killed 1. Knights of the Shadow killed 1. Swords of the Shadow killed 2. Langflood Axemen 1. Great Arc Champions 2. Now, again, this is work in progress. We haven't, like, balanced the units entirely, but we've kind of, I think, run them through a first draft, essentially. Here's what we think the stats ought to look like, and then we're gonna obviously tinker with it. But that's absolutely terrifying. Now, that was one of the most elite armies in Middle-earth, right? The High Elves, a ton of Noldor units. I think a lot of those units cause fear, actually. And so that was actually very, very, very difficult for us. So I shouldn't have been so cocky. I thought, we're up here on the hill. We've got siege weapons. We've got elite units of our own. We'll be able to hold out a little bit. No, indeed. So we got absolutely wrecked. Well, at any rate, I hope you enjoyed looking at the units, looking at the settlement distribution, and thinking a bit about how it might be to play Angmar in Total War Wainriders. We'll keep you updated about any other progress we are continuing to make on the mod. If you have any other factions you'd like to take a closer look at in the vein of this one, let me know in the comments. And I'll see you in the next one. Take care until then.